Are we living in a simulation? If you've seen The Matrix or even just heard about it, you might be familiar with this question and with the way that it's captured the public's imagination for decades. And for good reason. It's a fascinating question with either really high stakes or no stakes at all, depending on your personal philosophy. But it comes down to this. What if the world we see around us isn't real, but is an illusion created for us by some complex computer simulation that exists in the actual real world? Today we're going to explore this question from the perspective of physics and ask if this idea has any merit, would we ever be able to test such a thing, and what would even distinguish a simulated reality from a real one to begin with? If you enjoy the kind of conversations we have here on Why This Universe, then there's another University of Chicago podcast network show that you should check out. It's called The Pie. Join host Tess Vigland as she talks with leading economists about their cutting-edge research and key events of the day. Hear how the economic pie is at the heart of issues like the aftermath of a global pandemic, jobs, energy policy, and much more. You're listening to Why This Universe, a podcast where we break down the biggest ideas in physics. I'm Shalma Wegsman.
And I'm Dan Hooper. When physicists talk about this act of observing our universe and trying to make sense of it and the laws that govern it, we're usually working under the assumption that the universe is a real physical thing. But some people have argued that the world we know and love might not be the physical, quote-unquote, real thing that we all think it is, but instead could be some kind of simulated reality. In fact, there are some people, some smart people, I'd say, who have argued that it's not only possible, but even likely that we are all living right now in some kind of elaborate and sophisticated computer simulation. Today on Why This Universe, we're going to talk about this possibility. I'll tell you right up front that I'm not sure what I think of it. I kind of go back and forth on the strengths of these arguments. But we'll go over those arguments that people have made that are suggesting that there's a high likelihood that the thing we call our universe isn't a physical thing, but is rather some kind of simulated reality. And we'll also hit on what I at least perceive some of the weaknesses of these arguments to be. Should be fun.
I will say this is a very nonchalant way to just discuss whether our reality is real.
Yeah.
Just like, let's have like a just relaxed conversation about whether we should be freaking out about not really existing the way we think we do.
Well, I mean, it's not that we wouldn't exist. So even if I'm in a conscious mind in a simulated reality, that conscious mind is still real. That's the thing that matters to me. Mm-hmm. So, I am pretty relaxed about it. I to be honest, I barely care if reality is simulated or not. I mean, I'm interested. I'm curious, but I wouldn't say like it would upset me very much to learn it is.
So what exactly do we mean by living in a simulation? There are a ton of philosophical subtleties here, and we'll dig into a lot of them over the course of the episode. But to guide our conversation, let's start with this question. How could you create a computer simulation so good that it could convince someone that it's the real thing?
For me, at least, the easiest way that I can imagine this sort of thing is to picture a scenario where we take an ordinary human in the real world, the real physical world, and somehow give them sensory experience that, concocts or creates the impression of a simulated world around them. As a very weak version of this, you can imagine hooking someone up to a really good virtual reality rig or something like this, and maybe you're going to take their body and put them in a sensory deprivation chamber. And maybe you're going to hook their, nerve endings up to things that give you the impression that you're feeling surfaces or temperature or whatever, all that stuff. So you do all this stuff, and maybe, with the tech, being better than it is now, you could actually convince somebody that all the stuff they're experiencing around them is pretty real. Now, I played a little bit with VR myself in recent years. I don't own a rig, but I have a couple of friends who have good rigs. And let's just say I'm not going to mistake that experience for the real world just yet. But I could totally imagine that in, not that many years, the technology might exist for that sort of thing.
Yeah, I will say if you do that VR roller coaster, your stomach feels it, even if you're not totally convinced.
You might recognize the situation that we've been talking about so far from certain places in science fiction, like the movie The Matrix, which, I was a college student when that came out, or maybe my first year of grad school. I'm not sure. But I was blown away by that. I'd really never considered that possibility before. But, in case you haven't seen it, in these movies, human beings are put into something like a deep sleep-like state, and their brains are hooked up to a computer that causes them to perceive, see, hear, smell, and taste a compelling simulated version of the world, which they don't know is a simulation. So far, we've just been talking about taking an actual human being and hooking them up to something that gives them the perception of a world. But let's take it a step further. And instead imagine a situation where we're actually going to take a computer or some other mechanical machine and create in that a simulation of a world and a simulation of the conscious beings in that world. So there's not a brain outside of the computer anymore. The brain itself is part of the computer simulation.
If we were living in this scenario, everything we think we perceive about ourselves and our bodies would be just an illusion, not tied to a physical body we have outside of the simulation at all. We think we can move our limbs and scratch our skin, but all of those sensations are just being fed to us through a computer. Now, if you think about the fact that we might not really exist in this scenario, you might have an objection. You might say, hey, I know this can't be the case because I'm a conscious being. I have subjective experience. I experience an I'm self-aware. Therefore, I'm not just some software in a computer game. I'm a real consciousness. But let's dig into that and all the assumptions behind that take.
To most physicists, when we think about the human brain, we basically treat it as an elaborate and very complex physical machine, made up of things like neurons that process information, and ultimately all that information processing, somehow in a way we don't really understand yet, gives rise to consciousness.
So most physicists see consciousness and subjective experience as something that, if you dig deep into it, comes purely from the material world. In that case, there's no reason that you can't imagine that a machine or computer would also be able to develop consciousness. After all, there's no special ingredient that you need to add. If you have a complex enough system that's storing and processing information, it would just eventually develop consciousness. And a very complex machine may be able to hold multiple consciousnesses and be able to make them interact. However, not everyone feels this way about consciousness. Not everyone's a materialist, so to speak. Many people believe that it takes something beyond the physical to give some hunk of material a conscious mind. If you want to hear one person with that perspective, you can listen to our episode with David Chalmers. That's episode number 63. This is already so interesting, and I already have so many questions. For example, how would we know if we ever pulled this off, right? You can imagine a really advanced ChatGPT telling you that it's experiencing something, but how could we really be in the first person of the machine and know if it's really experiencing consciousness in the way that we do?
Yeah, I would just say, but deep down, we can't. But for that matter, am I really sure you're conscious, Shalma? You act like you are. If you're not, you're faking it really well. But I can't directly rule out the possibility that the only conscious thoughts that exist are my own, because they're the only ones I have first person experience of. But I still approach the world under the assumption that all those seemingly conscious beings are in fact conscious.
And that's a philosophically legitimate take, but I feel like most people do have an intuition where it's okay, we know that our brains are really similar. We're made of the same biology, and computer or a machine that's built out of electronics or something, can we trust what it's saying is conscious experience? Can we trust that that is similar to ours?
And you could imagine doing things to try to make us more confident that that would be true. Maybe at some point we have some sort of brains that have some electronic components but some biological ones. And like maybe we even replace or supplement parts of our brains with them. And like we do that and like, oh, still conscious. Okay. Right. And then you do a little bit more and like still conscious. And then the last neuron gets replaced with the last transistor. And like, then you wonder, are they conscious? Well, I mean, probably, right? It probably wasn't that last neuron, you know?
Right.
You know, it's not a completely intractable situation, I think.
So how powerful of a computer might you need to simulate even just one conscious mind?
The human brain consists of something like 100 billion neurons, and those neurons are connected to other neurons in something like 100 trillion different ways or 100 trillion different connections in your brain. And all of these synapses, these connections fire at a rate of something like, you know, every millisecond. So like 1,000 times every second. So you can kind of use these numbers to estimate how many operations a second you'd have to have a computer do before you could hope for it to perform generically as well as a human brain. The estimates for this vary. I find a bunch of them on the internet and in various pieces of the literature. But I found things that range from like 10 to the 14 operations per second all the way up to about 10 to the 18. So, you know, we're talking, you know, at least 100 trillion operations a second, but it could be like 10,000 times higher than that too. In contrast, modern computers carry out something like, you know, 10 billion or 10 to the 10 operations per second. So these are a lot slower than the human brain, at least for now. So they fall short in terms of like raw computing speed compared to a human brain by a factor of somewhere between like 10,000 and 100 million. So we have a long way to go before our computers are going to be potentially capable of generating authentically human levels of thought or consciousness. But there are good reasons to be optimistic that our computers are going to get faster, and maybe we'll reach that threshold pretty soon.
That's kind of nice. If you're ever having a bad day and you're like feeling a bit slow, just remember your brain's going at 10 to the 18 trillion.
10 to the 18 a second is a lot. That's a lot.
It's a lot going on in there. Give yourself a break.
There's another way in which human brains are like very different from typical computers. So typical computers perform all their operations in mostly what we call a serial fashion, like they do one operation after the other. But the human brain is a massively parallel computer. It does a bunch of things at once. So like there might be more to this problem than just number of operations. We might have to not only build a computer that can do 10 to the 14 or 10 to the 18 operations per second, but also somehow build them with an infrastructure that takes advantage of this huge, like, parallel nature of the human brain. But again, there's no reason, there's no argument for why in principle we couldn't do this one day. So let's try to speculate for a minute about how long it might be before we have computers that are fast enough to do this sort of stuff. I'm going to base this on what's known as Moore's Law, which is basically just the observation that for the last 50 years or so, computer processing speed, or the speed of our fastest computers, has been increasing at an exponential rate, and a pretty uniform exponential rate. Namely, every 2 years or so, for 50 years, so a lot of doubling times, the speed of our fastest computers have approximately doubled. So this means that after 10 years or so, any given decade, the speed of our fastest computers increased by a factor of about 30. In 3 decades, it increases by a factor of more than 30,000. And in all 50 of those years, it's increased by a factor of more than 30 million. So like dramatic, increases over time because of this exponential growth. And if we take this and we project it forward, and frankly, I don't see any particularly compelling reason to think Moore's Law is going to suddenly break or stop progressing. Even if it were to slow down, it wouldn't change the answer that dramatically. But if I just extrapolate forward blindly, we should be able to build computers that have speeds equal or exceeding those of the human brain at sometime between like 25 and 50 years from now. So we've got a while but, a little luck and this sort of thing could happen even in our lifetimes.
Some people have argued that Moore's law might not be the whole story. For example, maybe this exponential doubling eventually slows down as we start to approach the limits of how small transistors can be. For example, maybe quantum mechanics will ultimately impose a limit on this. But it's possible that we can push through these limits by either just making our computers larger, the size of entire planets even, or maybe quantum computing will help us continue to push through to reach higher and higher computing power. Either way, if you're a little imaginative, you can imagine that building computers this powerful will be possible one day.
Let's imagine, based on these arguments, that at some point, like late in the 21st century, we attain the ability to build computers that are comparably fast or powerful as the human brain. Once we have such machines, we could in principle write or otherwise create brain-like software that we could run on these machines, ultimately allowing us to build minds that are not only intelligent, but legitimately conscious. With even more powerful computers, we could then create simulations of environments where those simulated brains or minds could explore and interact. In other words, we could create conscious minds who live entirely within a simulated world. To me, and to a lot of other people who have thought about this, it seems entirely plausible that one day we could build simulated worlds, and maybe even like late in this century or so. Like that doesn't seem like an implausible goal. But just because we could possibly do something doesn't necessarily mean that we're likely to do that one day. But in this case, there have been a lot of arguments made for why it probably is likely that we're going to do this, and we're going to do this a lot of times, simulating a lot of minds and a lot of simulated worlds. You can think of a lot of reasons why somebody might decide to do this. We might just do this for entertainment, basically like, we could decide that we want to create elaborate realistic video games and hook ourselves up to them. Or we might even just want to create simulated worlds and then kind of watch those figures, those characters in those shows, watch their lives play out, in the same way we might watch reality television or something. We might want to produce simulations of one or more of our ancestors. You could, you really miss somebody. You want to have a version of them that seems realistic and whatever. And you might do that. Maybe you want to better understand what some distant point in history or time or place was. You might make a simulation of that. You might want to do this as some sort of experiment, set initial conditions up and see how they play out. Maybe you want to find out, maybe you want to do a war game planning for the Pentagon. And you, ask when, certain actions are taken by one country, how do people respond to it? And you do it 1 billion times so you get a good statistical sample of outcomes or something. Like that might be the sort of thing you would want to build realistic simulations that include conscious beings in it. There are all sorts of reasons, to think you might want to do this.
What a trip if you learned that your consciousness exists just to simulate your vote on one particular election.
But it's not an irrational thing to do. It might be a selfish thing to do. There are all sorts of ethical questions with this, but...
Sounds like an expensive thing to do.
Well, that's true now, but can you imagine 50 years ago the idea that we would be making this podcast on the supercomputer that is my laptop? That sounds prohibitively expensive for, our little show here, right? And it's not a big deal. Like the laptop was not a big deal to acquire.
Maybe you just want to simulate consciousness for the sake of art and
sure.
See what happens and explore our own consciousness through observing the simulation.
I mean, I like to play role-playing games, and kind of that's just like a collective simulation of a fictional or fantasy world. I totally see why the creative spark in human beings would want you to create simulations of worlds and minds.
At this point in our conversation, I started to wonder, what exactly is the distinction between a so-called simulated world and a real world anyway? Sure, the simulation is man-made in this example rather than biological, But we're still talking about real consciousnesses. We're still talking about a physical system of transistors and electric currents existing and interacting within its own physical world. So even though the consciousnesses in this simulated reality don't necessarily have the bodies that they think they do, can we really say that one is any less real than another?
So, like, there's a deep philosophical question here, which is, so when I play Legend of Zelda, okay, and my Link character draws out his sword, I don't look at that sword and go like, that sword is real. I say that sword is not real. I think it is virtual. It is, fictional. It's whatever, And I think I know what I mean when I say that. But there are philosophers who say that what it means for something to exist or whatever is just a question of, your perception of it. They think ideas or thoughts or something are like the underpinning of reality. And to an idealist like that, maybe Link's sword is just as real as what I would call a physical real sword in our universe. So I'm open-minded to that sort of objection.
Okay, maybe it's not real in the sense that it's a physical sword that you could really use as a sword. You can't use it as a sword. You can only use it as a sword in the game, whatever that means. But it still is actually having there's like a causal impact that sword in the game is still having, where it's like affecting how you're playing the game. It's affecting your like physiology because you're reacting to the game, you're moving your fingers and whatever. So in that sense, I think it's still real. It's just not a sword. It's not a physical sword.
And then of course this all like falls down into the great philosophical tradition of skepticism, where you have to ask like, that thing that I think is a physical object, a physical sword or whatever, like how do I know that's not just a bunch of ideas, a bunch of thoughts? Like, how do I know that anything is physical? I mean, to that person in the simulation, they might think that virtual sword is a physical sword. And, we think things are physical, but, we can't really know that.
I also think even just like the fact that the Link sword we're calling it a sword, I think that does kind of appeal to the idealist logic, because in every way it's not a sword, right? Like you can't touch it. It's not made of metal. Like you can't cut anything with it. And yet we're calling it a sword. Why? Because it like represents this idea of a sword. Yeah.
A few pixels on a screen, but functionally this fictional character uses it in the way that this physical object would be used. And therefore, yeah, exactly.
So maybe simulations are just as real as the real world. But is there any way to know which one we are experiencing right now? Is there any reason we have to believe that the world we think of as real is actually a computer simulation?
So this is where the ideas of the philosopher Nick Bostrom come in. So he's a Swedish philosopher at the University of Oxford, and he's famous for a bunch of stuff. But in 2003, he wrote a really influential article with the provocative title, "Are You Living in a Computer Simulation?" So I'm going to paraphrase some of this. This isn't exactly how Bostrom made the argument, but I think it captures the essence of it. So to get what Bostrom's going to get at, let's consider something like the following scenario. So a few hundred years pass, technology continues to grow in the sort of ways that it has, and human beings go on to create far more simulated minds than there have ever been physical minds in the course of human history. So maybe trillions or hundreds of trillions or trillions of separate simulated minds, all in simulated realities. If that's the case, then you should start to ask yourself, how sure am I that I'm not a simulated mind? After all, most of those simulated minds, let's say for the sake of argument, don't realize that their world isn't the physical world, if that's even a fair way to say it. And if I simulate 100 simulated minds, all of which think they're in the physical world, then I should think that there's a 99% chance that I'm simulated as well, at least. So, Bostrom's imagining a scenario here where if the vast majority of conscious beings who think they live in the real world don't, then you probably don't either. Okay, so basically, Bostrom then argues that from these arguments, at least one of the following three has to be true. Either human civilization or other comparable civilizations are unlikely to ever reach a level of technological maturity where they're capable of producing simulated realities. Maybe this is just like, it can't be pulled off for some technical reason. Maybe, they all destroy themselves with nuclear weapons and climate change before they get there. I don't know. In any number of things, but something stops them from being able to do it. Option 2 is they get to that level of technology, but they don't really choose or otherwise, act to simulate a lot of simulated minds. Maybe like they want to use their energy for other stuff. Maybe they have ethical considerations that prevent them from doing it very much. Who knows? But for what they could do it, but they don't do it. Okay. So that's the second option. And then the third option is we're almost certainly right now living in a computer simulation. One of those three things, according to Bostrom, has to be true.
If you're a big fan of not living in a simulation, this might be a bit of a sting. But don't fret yet. There are lots of gaps and assumptions in this argument where it may fall through.
I'm not sure what I think of some of these. I've gone back and forth on my opinions on some of these. The first is something called substrate independence. So this would have fit in nicely with that conversation we had with David Chalmers last year. But so this is a common assumption that's made among philosophers of mind, and basically, the assumption is like mental states come down to information, which could be encoded in something like neurons in the human brain or in like silicon chips or something in a computer or whatever you build your computer out of. And if the same information is encoded in there, then the same conscious states arise. But there are some philosophers who say that they're not sure that's true, or maybe they are even arguing it's unlikely to be true. And maybe there's something else. Maybe you can build a simulated brain in a computer and it will act just like a human brain, but it won't have any conscious experience. There'll be a philosopher's zombie in that nomenclature, right? So they'll act just like a conscious being, but they won't actually have any first person conscious experience. And if that's the case, then Bostrom's argument falls apart, because you could simulate trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions of minds, but none of them would have conscious experience. Everyone who's having conscious experience would be in the quote unquote physical real world. Another interesting thing to consider is that it might not be possible to get enough computing power to ever produce a highly detailed simulation, right? So we said you need 10 to the 18 computations per second to get to the level to simulate a human mind. But let's say that number's wrong. Let's say that it's not just the number of neurons and how many times they fire across different connections, but maybe the individual molecules in those neurons somehow give rise to different kinds of conscious states. And that means that you don't need 10 to the 18 bits of information being processed every second, but you need 10 to the 28 or 10 to the 38 or something, at which point, maybe that will never happen. Or if it will happen, it will be, thousands or hundreds of thousands of years from now at Moore's Law, something that, not in the foreseeable future. I think we can't rule that out yet. I personally think that's kind of unlikely, but, I wouldn't rule it out.
I mean, one way or another, nature figured out how to make it work in a pretty small amount of space. What is brain, 10 pounds?
Yeah. So we know for sure that, a few pounds of organic matter can create consciousness. But, just think about how many atoms are in there, right? And if you had to simulate that number of atoms, so maybe you can do it, but it requires building something that is made of organic material and is shaped and functions like a brain. Maybe that's the only way to do it. I don't know. It's a logical possibility.
Yeah. I mean, there might be a way that that's what nature landed on. And I know I mentioned it before briefly when talking about Moore's Law, but I think an interesting question is thinking about quantum computers, just because ultimately biological material, it's quantum, right? At some level, deep down. And all of our computers so far aren't, right? In the sense that, like, obviously deep down, the components are made out of quantum parts, but they don't function, like, in the quantum ways, right?
Yeah, and the way they process information is classical, yeah.
Right, exactly. So it could be that maybe something about, like, the complexity that comes with quantum interactions is also kind of necessary for consciousness to arise out of a system.
So there have been people who've made that argument. Roger Penrose wrote at least one book famously arguing this decades ago. I don't find his arguments compelling, but, Roger Penrose is a smart guy, obviously, so you should take, him seriously. But no, I personally don't think that those arguments hold water. But smart people disagree with me, so people should know that.
These arguments by Penrose and others about the quantum nature of the brain can make up a whole episode on their own. But to wrap up our conversation, we want to address whether this question of do we live in a simulation holds any weight at all. Is it just a philosophical thought experiment, or is it something that we could one day test? Is there any evidence that we could look for that our world is just a computer?
You can ask yourself, what would a universe that somebody simulated look like, and how might it be different from a physical universe? One possibility is because you're building this thing with a finite amount of computing power, maybe not everything will be super high resolution, right? Or maybe not all of it will be simulated. Maybe they'll only simulate the parts of it that conscious minds are looking at. So there's this episode of Rick and Morty. They're on a alien spacecraft. They think, but in fact, they're only simulating the parts of it they're seeing, and it's just they're all in a computer simulation. So I'm picturing something like that.
In other words, nothing in the universe would be simulated unless a conscious actor was there to observe it. This would save computing power and avoid you having to simulate every particle in the whole universe all of the time. So if there's some region of space out there where there are no conscious actors, the simulation might not function there.
You could imagine, though, that you could test this hypothesis by finding out if there's like a logical self-consistency to the whole universe. So maybe you simulate one place in isolation, and then you simulate another place in isolation, and you don't bother to simulate the stuff in between them. But it turns out those two places aren't completely isolated in a physical world. They would interact and influence each other. If you could measure enough about all those particles and all of the trajectories of everything and all their states, you might be able to demonstrate that there's no way those two parts of the simulated world could be part of the same physical world. It sounds really, really hard to do, but like at least in principle, maybe something like that could be done. Another possibility is to be looking for evidence that the resolution is truncated at some level. So like, let's say we live in a purely classical world where like none of the laws of quantum mechanics apply. And, space is infinitesimally divisible and time is infinitesimally divisible, which means if I want to tell you precisely where something is or what time something happened, I need an infinite amount of data to do that, or infinite amount of information. That's something you wouldn't be able to simulate. So you might expect space-time or things like this to be discretized, like it come in chunks, like a grid at some level. And some people have argued that quantum mechanics is kind of that. I'm not sure if it really is. I think there's just as much information content in a quantum state as a classical state, maybe more. So I'm not sure that actually solves the problem, but it's the sort of thing you might look for evidence of living in a simulation.
Right. I feel like that this is a thought I've had sometime in the past of, maybe this whole like wave function superposition situation where the particle doesn't decide its state until it's observed. Maybe that saves computing power. We don't have to decide where all the particles are. They're just like roughly around here until someone looks.
Yeah. If like Copenhagen's interpretation of quantum mechanics where wave functions collapse looks like something you'd do if you were simulating the universe, right? Yeah. Wow. That's a rabbit hole we can go down one day. So the more I read about these different arguments for like why we're likely to be in a simulation or unlikely to be in a simulation or whatever, I noticed more and more that these look like arguments I've seen before, but in a very different context. I read a lot of philosophy, or at least have over the course of my life. And a lot of that were like theologians arguing for evidence of a creator. And a lot of the arguments in favor or against a creator look like arguments in favor or against being in a reality that was created by a simulator. Like what would somebody do if they decided to make our universe for the purposes we're imagining? Like what kind of world would they create? Et cetera. And, maybe we ascribe different motives to God or a creator of the universe as we would to a creator of a simulation. But it's the same sort of thing. You're kind of guessing at their psychology and trying to deduce from that what are, and maybe not just psychology, but their limitations and their abilities and things like this. And, trying to deduce from that whether our universe is like the sort of thing we think they would have been likely to create. So I don't know where I come down on the likelihood of us living in a simulation. I think Bostrom's argument is pretty airtight or pretty close anyway. I mean, with a couple of caveats, but I'm just not sure whether I think it's likely that we're going to reach the ability to simulate lots of people. And then if we do, that we'll actually decide to do it. We might. And if that's the case, then we're probably all simulations. But again, I'm not really bothered by that. I'm perfectly happy living in a simulated universe. That doesn't bother me even a little.
If it's completely untestable and irrelevant, it's hard to be bothered. Why This Universe is brought to you by the University of Chicago Podcast Network. It's edited and produced by me, Shalma Wegsman, and my co-host is Dan Hooper, a professor of astrophysics at the University of Chicago and Fermilab. If you like our show and you want to support us even more, you can find us on Patreon. There you can access ad-free episodes of the show, as well as exclusive Ask Us Anything episodes where you get to ask Dan and I direct questions about physics or anything else. So if you are curious about that, you can find it at patreon.com/whythisuniverse. Thank you so much for listening and for your support.